we'll start momentarily. We're just waiting for the live stream of our online audience to begin. Good evening, everyone. Happy Hanukkah and welcome to JW3. Tonight's event is fully booked. Some people will be continuing to come on in, so if you could make it as easy as possible for them to find their own seats, that would be much appreciated. We are delighted to welcome those online and those in person for this evening's official commemoration ceremony to mark the departure of Jews from Arab lands and Iran, and the expulsion of Jews from Arab lands and Iran. If this is your first time connecting with JW3, we're really delighted to have you here. And if not, welcome back. JW3 is the Jewish community centre that's open to all. And that all means a lot more these days with our online audience. It's meant that our definition of community has expanded to our thriving online audience. Tonight we have a really special evening filled with many speeches and addresses from incredible leaders of the community. Sephardi Voices UK have created a wonderful film outlining the story that we'll be sharing tonight. And that story is about the Suez crisis and the expulsion of Jews from Egypt specifically. We'll also be hearing a wonderful poem written by Yvonne Green, written specially for this evening, as well as having a wonderful candle lighting led by Rabbi Joseph Dweck, senior rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogues. So this evening will mark the 65th anniversary of the Suez expulsion of Jews. 65th. Tonight's event is a vital part of JW3's work to create a program that reflects our audience and the diversity of the community that we're a part of. It expresses one of our key values of hachlala, inclusion, and also responds to the much-needed Board of Deputies Commission on Racial Inclusivity. This evening isn't just professional for me, though. I don't just come to you as the programmer here at JW3, but I come to you as a grandchild of people from Egypt, refugees from Egypt. My grandparents, Albert and Rose Munir, were expelled from Egypt in 1957, along with many people in this room and relatives of people in this room. So I come here on a personal level as well. I want to just mention their names. It's thanks to their sacrifice that I stand here today, able to host this evening, and that our family continues to hold our identity Sephardi and Jewish. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our partner and co-founder of Harif, Lynn Julius, to share a bit about the importance of this day specifically. Welcome, Lynn.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. Good evening, and on behalf of Harif, the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all. This is actually our 7th annual commemoration. And to those of you watching on Facebook or YouTube, good afternoon, bonsoir, bienvenue, erev tov, baruchim habaim. I'd like to thank Joe Hyman and JW3 for hosting this evening. It's been a great pleasure to work with Joe. I'd like to thank our Harif volunteers, our team, Michelle Huberman, Ralph Assor, Sandra Dangour, Kim Cohen, and Lawrence Julius. And I'd like to thank our special guests here tonight, Rabbi Joseph Dweck, Board of Deputies President Marie van der Zil, Claudia Mendoza of the Jewish Leadership Council, and Efrat Perri, representing the Israeli Embassy. So what is significant about the 30th of November? It was the day after the UN passed General Assembly Resolution 181 on the partition plan for Palestine. This was in November 1947. Riots erupted across the Arab world. Arab League states targeted Jewish citizens for persecution and dispossession, as the Jewish minority of Palestine. The Jewish communities in Arab countries were established well before there were any Arabs. Within one generation, these ancient communities were wiped out. After the Islamic Revolution, 4/5 of the ancient Jewish community of Iran fled for their lives. This Jewish exodus was one of the largest displacements of non-Muslims until the forced exodus of Christians from Iraq. We are here to remember the 850,000 Jews driven from their homes with often nothing but the clothes on their backs. There are less than 4,000 Jews remaining in Arab countries today. Tonight, there are lots of significant anniversaries we could be remembering. This year is the 80th anniversary of the Nazi-inspired Farhud massacre of 1941 in Iraq. It sounded the death knell for the oldest Jewish diaspora. It is 70 years since the exodus of 95% of Iraq's Jews on Operation Ezra Nehemiah. It is 60 years since the Bizerte crisis in Tunisia, when hundreds of Jews were evacuated in a daring operation. It is 60 years since Operation Yachin, when 200,000 Jews were allowed to emigrate from Morocco after years in which they were denied that right. It is 50 years since 2,000 desperate Jews were smuggled out of Iraq, while others were being hanged and murdered. The survivors made the risky trek in the dead of night through Kurdistan and out to freedom. But tonight we have chosen to focus on the Suez Expulsion, whose 65th anniversary falls this year. I'd like to emphasize the anti-Semitic nature of the expulsion. Even though Italy and Greece were not party to the Suez attack, Jews with Italian and Greek passports were expelled without a right of return. And this laissez-passer here belongs to a Jew who had an Egyptian passport. So all Jews were punished simply for sharing the ethnicity and religion of Israelis. And just to say what it says here, valable pour un seul voyage sans retour, not allowed to return. In other words, expulsion. Of course, Suez is not the only story. We can't forget the 20,000 Egyptian Jews driven out before 1956. We can't forget the 400 Jews, the Jewish men arrested and jailed in Egypt after the Six-Day War, and many were tortured and abused. But we are not here merely to dwell on the past. We are here to celebrate a blessing. Despite all the suffering, despite losing everything, our parents escaped from oppressive police states and rebuilt their lives in Israel and the West. Viviane Bowell, who will later be in conversation with a wonderful advocate for Mizrahi rights, Hen Mazzig, says in her marvelous book, From Egypt with Love, a calamity is only a calamity when your response to it is to accept victimhood. Jews were not victims, but they were refugees. We have to keep repeating the truth. It's a truth that's continually being questioned, distorted, and denied. An Egyptian historian recently caused uproar when he said that after Suez, Jews left of their own free will. Jewish experience must not be glossed over. It must not be whitewashed. We must give Jewish refugees their rightful place in history and memory. Theirs is a fight for remembrance, for recognition, reparations and redress. As the celebrated human rights lawyer Erwin Kotler said, when there is no remembrance, there will be no justice. Where there is no justice, there is no authentic reconciliation between the parties and not just between states. Where there is no reconciliation, there will be no genuine peace. Thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce Alec Nacamuli, who is the chairman of Sephardi Voices UK, and they have made a wonderful film for us about the Suez Expulsion, and I'd like to hand over to you, Alec.
Thank you very much.
And just to say that Alec was born in Alexandria, and he was expelled in 1956.
Thank you, Lynn. Just to put in perspective some of the figures that Lynn was telling you about, if I look at the community of Egypt from which I come from, at the end of World War II, the Jewish community in Egypt numbered 85,000. And today, we are hard put to count 4 and 4 Jews across the whole of Egypt. Anyway, Sephardi Voices UK is an oral history registered charity, and it is dedicated to preserving the life histories of Jews from the Middle East, North Africa, and Iran who have resettled in the UK. So the film that you are about to see shows Jews from Egypt remembering the departure in the aftermath of the Suez crisis, which, as Lynn said, is also when I left Egypt. It is edited from extracts of the interviews from the Sephardi Voices UK archive. So these interviews, which last about 2 or 3 hours, cover family traditions and life in the country of birth, the circumstances of departure, and then resettlement in the UK and issues of identity and how do you transmit your heritage. And this unique archive is deposited at the British Library and at the Museum of the Jewish People, formerly Bet Hatfutzot in Tel Aviv. So to date, we have recorded about 120 interviews. We have also produced about 20 short films, either marking historical events like Suez, which you will see, or the Farhud, which Lynn mentioned, or are thematic like traditions for Passover or problems of identity. And also we have a treasure trove of photos of family life and religious occasions, as well as documents, school reports, passports, expulsion papers, like Lynn showed you. So our ambition now is to leverage this unique archive to produce educational material for schools, universities, genealogy, research, in response to the Board of Deputies' Commission on Racial Inclusivity recommendations to include Sephardi Mizrahi history and culture in Jewish education. So just a few words of thanks also to the Shasha and Shoresh Foundations, and particularly to the Dangour family and Dangour Education who have supported our work, and as well as many of you who might have made donations online. And if any of you would like to be interviewed or members of your family, please get in touch with us, or if you wish to support us. Thank you very much.
Before it all started, Nasser was in an open, top jeep with troops around him, go around the streets waving his hands and greeting everybody. He came past our block, we were on our way to school, and all the kids from Les Français ran towards him. And he was shaking hands. I actually shook his hands. Only later on in life you understand what you've done. But he was a hero to Egyptian people. He was a hero.
They sort of mobilized their entire machine to motivate people against the foreigners and against Israel. And even the songs that they used to sing were political. And some had catchy tunes, as at least I thought them then. And I would sing along with the words, not realizing that I'm on the wrong side.
We had to sit in the dark every evening, all huddled together for as long as, until we got the all clear. That was a bit scary. And also they had to rely on foreign news, obviously. So they used to all huddle around the radio and listen to the BBC News.
And for some reason, any porter became like a sort of the guardian of that place. Like, put the light off, don't walk, go this way. Sahyuni, Zionist.
We came to a point when it was too dangerous to live where we were. We felt our building was shaking with the bombing. It was a traumatic experience to actually see dead bodies from the windows from a balcony.
Suddenly, we weren't that welcome. Suddenly, we were being told to go. Suddenly, you were at home and not at home. So yes, something radically changed. Some schoolmates of mine chose to stone me, say Zionists, and these were kids that were on the same school bench as I was. Suddenly, I was perceived to be an enemy and the target.
My parents were under house arrest because they were British. They could only go out in the morning between 7 and 8 in the morning. Otherwise, they had to be home.
At the end of the 3 months, I remember my dad had to go to an office and register his name. Why? Because he was a British subject. Everybody who was British had to go and register. And soon after that, I remember a soldier, or some official, coming, and he told him that he had to leave. You have to leave, we give you 10 days, 10 days to leave, and you have to dispose of all your belongings, your furniture, everything, and you're only allowed to leave with a suitcase, with clothes. That's all you could take.
I do remember one day Dad coming in and saying, oh, we've now been given notice to be expelled. And I think we had 3 weeks to leave.
Dirty piece of paper shoved through the letterbox with the words expelled on it.
And one morning the doorbell rang very early in the morning, and the policeman stood up there, and he had a letter which contained our expulsion order. So that was quite quite a scary moment, really, because you'd heard about it, but it was finally hitting you personally.
We had like an open house. People came along and they wanted to buy everything, dirt cheap, sort of take it away type of thing. And she had a beautiful glass cabinet where she used to put ornaments and things like that, and pictures, and I was attached to that, and I said, what a shame that this has to go.
I do remember the last film that was shown in the cinema was The Man Who Knew Too Much, and the theme song was Que Sera Sera, and I remember we used to play it a lot at home with my aunt, and that always, for a long time after that, if I heard it, I just got very nostalgic and a bit tearful.
This picture was taken on New Year's Eve, 1956, the day before we left for England, and it's at a neighbor of ours. So we celebrated New Year together and left the next day.
So we got searched very, very thoroughly at the airport, and the customs officer took my doll. It was a baby-size doll, and the head was joined to the arms and legs with elastic ends. And I remember he pulled out the head of the doll, looked inside to see if there was anything hidden in it. Of course, there wasn't. But you know, the elastic never kind of went back properly.
Before we got on the ship, there were some Egyptian guards, and my mother had a little kind of pin brooch on her suit, which was from my grandmother, and it wasn't of great value, and they snatched it off her, and she started to cry.
My father had 3 expensive watches, which were, you know, hidden by the cupboard. But the guy in front of him was hauled over because he had the watches. So he got so scared, he took 2 of them off and put them in the bin.
Put them under the bench and broke them and just left them there.
That's right.
And he took his watch from his wedding, which my uncle had presented to him.
And they all came to say goodbye to us. And it was terrible because everybody was crying. I was sobbing, leaving my cousins, whom I love so much, and my uncles and aunts. And we had no idea where we were going. We had no idea whether we would ever see our family again. And we were going to England. We knew nobody in England. So it was really awful. It was quite a traumatic experience, actually.
The only thing I was petrified about was that I would somehow get left behind, or that I would somehow let go of my mother's hand in the throb of people going onto the boat of refugees and get lost. This, I remember that so clearly, clasping her hand and the doll that I managed to take in my other hand as if my life depended on it.
It happened very late at night. My father turned up because previously he was taken to prison, so he was kind of on bail. We all travelled together and we ended up at the top of the Suez Canal by the Mediterranean, and we all jumped into a barge, big barge, and they covered us in the middle. This is the dead of the night. They covered us with tarpaulin over us. Jews from all over Egypt. And we took us to British battleships on the Mediterranean.
In some way, we were fortunate. We were one of the first people to leave Egypt. We had somewhere to go. The British looked after us.
They put us in a coach and took us to Kidderminster refugee camp. The refugee camp had been an old Italian prisoner of war camp, and they were cells. They were like cells. It was like being put in prison. Then I just thought, oh my God, what's happened? Then it's like the light went out.
I'll tell you something, why I mentioned my sister, the stewardess. You know, Ella used to fly to Egypt. She decided, you know, we're here for 2 days. This time I'm going to go to Port Said, visit our home. She phoned me up from Egypt, crying her eyes out, sobbing. You got to see it, you got to see it. Our home is still there, empty, boarded up. The neighbours knew her. She was 20 years older. She was crying. She says, we've still got our pictures in our coffee table. You know, you put pictures and you put the glass on top of the coffee. They're still there. Of our parents and grandparents. I can't touch them because I don't want to get in trouble. They're still, our furniture was still there. Our piano was still there. Some of the chandeliers were taken. But our pictures there, Unbelievable. In the mid-70s, 20 years after we left.
Sephardi Voices UK for commissioning this film, incredibly evocative film. I'd like to introduce Marie van der Zyl, President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews.
Thank you. Rabbi Dweck, distinguished guests, friends, good evening. I would really like to thank the organisers of tonight's event. I know just how hard you've worked from the family who are here supporting you. Thank you, Harif. Thank you, Sephardi Voices UK and JW3 for bringing us all together to mark this really horrific and very, very important anniversary and all the other anniversaries that Lynn Julius has described to us. And as President of the Board of Deputies, I'm especially proud when one of our member organisations, Harif, and synagogues are involved in events like tonight. We really are very proud of you. The history of Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews must be preserved. And I'm very glad that the commission that the Board of Deputies has done of inclusivity has had such an important impact, and we are delighted and absolutely agree that the heritage and archives must be preserved for the future, because Jews should know the history of Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews just as much as the Ashkenazi section of the community, because we've all had different experiences. We respect that, but we're still one, and this is an extremely important time. And so we therefore are very proud to see the fascinating tapestry of the Jewish experience, sharing good moments, and those, to be quite honest with you, I felt great pain watching that film that we've had tonight, when you actually see people, hear people giving their personal experiences. It really does shake you and cause you to really feel so much empathy, though I cannot possibly imagine how painful expulsion must have been. And we have to make sure that it's not a lesser known moment in the Jewish story. So we come together to preserve the memory and the history of the Jewish community in places where there are no longer communities. And it's very sad to hear that there are only some 4,000 Jews left in Arab lands today, and they must be extremely brave. What's important also, as well as preserving heritage, is also to take steps to try and protect cemeteries and places of worship in the Arab world, because they will be in danger of disappearing. We need to continue to work hard to get greater recognition of Jewish refugees from Arab lands, both within the Jewish community and outside it, in terms of education, legislation, and recognition of status and restitution. It's my hope that all of those here tonight and those online will really hear the powerful testimonies in the film and those we're going to hear afterwards. And a special thanks to Hen Mazzig and Viviane Bowell, who are going to go on and educate all of us about the plight of these Jewish refugees. I'm really looking forward to the rest of tonight and would like to thank all of you and to wish you Chag Chanukah Sameach, and we know that light will prevail over darkness. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. I'd like to call to the stage Claudia Mendoza, Co-Chief Executive of the Jewish Leadership Council.
Thank you so much. I was really delighted when Lynn asked if I would say a few words this evening, so a very big thank you. I think it's become ever more important to discuss and record the experiences of Jews from the Middle East, Jewish refugees from the Middle East. And so I really want to commend everyone who's been involved in organising this evening, from Harif to Sephardi Voices, and of course to JW3. It's great to be here. But not just for today, for every day, because the work you do is truly extraordinary. I first learned about Harif when I heard Lynn speak at Limud a few years ago, and I really remain grateful for your very important work. I have a particular and personal interest in this issue because my mother's family hail from Aden, at the time a British colony and now part of Yemen. When I think back to the stories she told me as a child, they were always happy ones. So when I learned later on in life of the trauma that her and her family went through, it was quite shocking. Things started to deteriorate in Aden, as they did for Jews all over the Middle East. As we saw in the video and as was spoken about, in the run-up to the Six-Day War, Nasser's voice could be heard bellowing from the radio where he would whip up anti-Jewish feeling. The Jews were left feeling terrorized as their Arab neighbors and friends turned on them. In 1967, my grandfather was murdered, leaving my grandmother to raise 8 children alone. They were moved to a Jewish-owned hotel and evacuated by the British Army, thanks to the good efforts of Barnett Janner. He was a hero who saved the Jews of Aden and someone my family often talk about. My mother was only 12 when she fled, and her recollection of the events is patchy. It's why I was really pleased to partner with Sephardi Voices UK earlier this year, where I joined my uncle to uncover some more about my own family's history. Despite the hardship that my family obviously endured when they arrived in the UK, I never heard of any bitterness or resentment, just fortitude and gratitude, and I think that's paid off in their loyalty to this country. But the clarity with which they speak today when they talk about threats to Jewish life, threats to your life because you're a Jew, resonate. It's why, despite being free, we must be vigilant. Anti-Semitism will sadly always be with us. But when we see it becoming normalized, minimized, justified, we must fight back. And that's the story of Hanukkah, which is why we're here this evening, as well as to commemorate, obviously, this anniversary. Hanukkah celebrates light over darkness. We celebrate pride in Jewish tradition, the Jewish people, and the land of Israel. I've seen what it looks like not to be free. It's the story of my family and of so many of yours. So we light the menorah and we leave it where it can be seen in order to celebrate our difference as Jews. But within that difference, there is yet more difference, be it in religious denomination or our Jewish roots. The accusation of Ashken normativity, as highlighted in the Board of Deputies Commission on Racial Inclusivity, is something which I know many will feel. I'm proud to lead, together with my co-CEO, Michelle Janes, who herself is of Egyptian and Iraqi descent, the Jewish Leadership Council. At the JLC, we will always embrace the full diversity of our amazing community, and this includes so many of you here this evening. Thank you again to everyone who has organised this evening. Your voices, our voices must be heard. Thank you, and Chanukah Sameach.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm honoured to welcome to the stage Efrat Perri, Director of Public Diplomacy at the Israeli Embassy.
President of the Board of Deputies, Claudia, Rabbi Dweck, Lynn, thank you for your work to organize this wonderful event, fellow speakers and guests. It is an honor to join you this evening for what promises to be an insightful and important event. The story of the Jews from Arab lands and Iran is the story of the State of Israel. Having been expelled from the place they called home for millennia, forced to leave their belongings, the place their ancestors lived and were buried, Jews from Arab lands and Iran found themselves needing to rebuild in hostile and difficult conditions. And much like the young state that became a home, MENA Jews were unquestionably successful in creating new opportunities and a new life on the shoulders of a proud and meaningful history. 600,000 of over the 800,000 Jewish people who fled Arab lands and Iran in the last century found sanctuary in the State of Israel. And it is the story of the Jews from Arab land and Iran that highlights what we know to be true. Israel is not luxury, but a necessity for Jewish people to both survive and to thrive. To this day, the State of Israel remains a point of refuge for Jews, a land of prospect for refugees, and a place to carve out a new life. It would be incorrect not to acknowledge that for too long the voices of Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews were marginalized from the Zionist story. We are now entering a new era where stories that for too long were hidden from history are being shared and celebrated. Commemorating days such as today, the 30th of November, which the Knesset voted to officially recognize in 2014, acknowledging the significant influence that MENA Jews had on creating and shaping Israeli culture and society is of extreme importance. I can attest that it is a priority of the State of Israel and the priority of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that the story of Jews from Arab lands and Iran is told around the world. With this in mind, I'm extremely grateful to be here today and to have the chance to hear Hen and Viviane's story. Thank you.
Thank you to Efrat for joining us this evening and sharing those words. It's my pleasure to invite our keynote speakers for the evening, Hen Mazzig and Viviane Bowell. For a decade, Hen has been an educator on Jews of the Middle East and North Africa. Born and raised in Israel to an Iraqi Jewish mother and Tunisian Amazigh Jewish father, his mission has been sharing their stories globally. He's appeared on Jewish issues throughout media on 4 continents, and he was named Allgemeiner's top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life in 2018 and in this year. His online content has reached many, many people throughout the world. He has a higher engagement rate than our fellow celebrities Kim Kardashian, Cristiano Ronaldo, and Nike, to name a few, and it's valuable content. In 2019, Hen co-founded the Tel Aviv Institute, who have supported tonight's event, a non-profit dedicated to using data-driven social media strategies to stand up for Jewish people and other minorities online. His first book, A Jew of Color, will be published in the spring of 2022 by Wicked Sun Books. Welcome, Hen, to the stage. Viviane is a member of the Harif and now JW3 community. Viviane has spent the past year or so recording her experiences as a Jew from Egypt. It's been a pleasure getting to know Viviane over the past few months, talking to her about her story, sharing memories, and stories are so valuable, especially on a night like this. We've heard snippets of stories from our speakers, but it's now my pleasure to welcome Viviane up to the stage to share a more in-depth story with Hen.
Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Viviane.
Good evening, Hen.
How are you?
Nervous.
Don't be. I'll be nice.
Thank you.
I was so inspired. First of all, I loved your book, and I was so inspired, and I'm honored also to have the opportunity to speak to you, because I grew up with my grandmother, much like some of the speeches that we heard today, telling me great stories about Iraq and how lovely it was and how welcomed and safe they felt. And only later on, when I started asking about this, why did you even leave if it was so great? She told me that it wasn't that great. And I think, I wish she wrote a book like you did. And thinking about that, what really made you write this book?
Well, the book initially was only going to be 20 pages in a recipe book, an introduction, and the idea was to write something about both sides of my family for my grandson. So when he grows up, if he's got any questions. And then I realized very quickly that it wasn't going to be that. And then the book grew on its own. And then I thought, well, there's three things that I want. The first thing is to talk about the Sephardi community I grew up in. As has been mentioned, it was about 85,000 Jews at one time. Now there's only a handful. And I really feel that I am proud of my heritage and my legacy. And if I don't talk about it, or my generation doesn't talk about it, it'll disappear completely. It'll sink into oblivion. And I don't want that to happen. So anything that's written or documented is something. The other thing I wanted to talk about was Cairo, or Egypt, because it was, when we were there, I had a happy childhood. And Cairo was not the city that people think. We didn't live in tents. Cairo was called the Paris of the Nile. It was a very modern city. So I want to talk about that and Egypt. That was such a big part of my life. And lastly, I want to talk about my experience as a refugee, which, I mean, watching the film tonight was actually quite painful and brought back a lot of memories. And I want to talk about feeling uprooted, still feeling uprooted now after all these years.
So tell us about your parent. Maybe that's where we should begin with the Aleppo culture, your paternal history.
The Aleppo culture, yeah. So my mother's side came from Aleppo, and the Aleppo culture is, as far as I remember from my mother's family, very secretive. So nothing is ever discussed outside the family. You never expose children to anything bad or death. You don't talk about your problems. And with my mother, and I suppose it might be typical of Aleppo as well, the culture, Jewish Aleppo, is if you don't talk about something, if you pretend it's not happening, then it'll go away. That's how I was brought up. It was also a very materialistic society, and wealth was quite important. My father's family was completely the opposite. They came from Toledo originally, then got expelled in 1492, ended up in Constantinople and eventually Egypt. They spoke Ladino, mostly when my father didn't want us to understand. And they were much more jolly, much more affectionate. My mother wasn't affectionate at all. So I grew up with although we were Sephardi, it was two different cultures completely.
That's very interesting. And I think we're seeing it with many of those communities. I know where one of the terms that were mentioned tonight was Mizrahi Jews, and we know that Sephardi was more relating to the Sephardi Jewish community that was expelled from Spain, but also because Maimonides and other scholars brought a lot of this Sephardi religious traditions, that became like the umbrella term to identify Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. But I think I think for myself at least, and I think a lot of young Jews today are saying that the Mizrahi identity, they feel like it's more, they relate to it. Personally, my family never spoke Ladino. They weren't. They did follow the Sephardi. I mean, we're still following Sephardi religious practices, but the identity was not really Sephardi, I think. So. What I'm trying to say is basically that those communities are so different. Although we're using umbrella terms to describe them, every community is so unique. And how did your mom ended up in Egypt?
My grandmother. Aleppo was after 1869 and the building of the Suez Canal. Aleppo ceased to be, the importance of Aleppo on the Silk Road diminished, and my grandparents moved to Cairo for economic reasons. Likewise, my paternal grandparents left Constantinople because the Ottoman Empire was beginning to crumble. So both of them was for economic reasons. But I mean, to say the cultures were completely different. And I mean, for instance, my maternal grandmother only spoke Arabic, Syrian Arabic, and she didn't speak French or English. And in fact, she couldn't read or write because that was a society where she'd been brought up was girls got married very, very young, and all their function in life was to just learn everything they could from their mothers and just get married and, bring up a family. So, yeah, the two, and the cooking was different. They were completely different. So I'm lucky that I had two, bit odd, but, you know, two completely different cultures that I was brought up with.
Yeah, and so you write in your book, until the Suez crisis, you're writing very favorably about Egypt. What is your memories from growing up there?
Well, I had a happy childhood, although very, very protected, which didn't really serve me a lot when I was older. But children were protected. So I had a French education anyway, and we spoke French at home. I didn't speak English. I went to a French school, and we learned English, but it was non-existent. So I have to say, of all the teachers, I remember our English teacher, because her name was Miss Volkonsky, and she was a Russian, she'd escaped from Russia, and she said she was a Russian princess. I think she was, I'm sure she was. And she used to dress all in white with a white turban, so she looked like a ghost. And she was really very thin, and she terrified the life out of me. So I never learned any English. But apart from that, we spoke French at home. My parents didn't actually have much to do with the local population at all. So we had servants. I'm sorry, I have to apologize every time I say we have servants, but they were treated very well. And Sunday was just for the family. And contrary to what people think, we had, big department stores and race course and a theatre and modern apartment blocks and department store with the latest fashion. So it was a very good life while it lasted.
It's really important for you, I feel, also in the book, to say that contrary to what people think, Egyptian Jewish culture was not what people think, that it wasn't, you didn't live in shacks and it wasn't, you didn't live in tents. It was very, incredible community. Why is it important for you to discuss that?
Because there's all these assumptions, even now, that because we lived in Egypt, Cairo was just like, I don't know what people think. There must be something between tents and apartment blocks, but wherever they think we lived. But also because we were educated, and people, most of us spoke 3 languages. The men spoke 4 or 5 languages. And there was always this assumption, especially when we came to England, that because we'd lived in Egypt, we weren't educated. I think they're surprised that I could read and write, but... So it was very important for me to set the record straight and say that, Cairo in the 1950s and Alexandria as well were very modern cities. In fact, if anything, they've gone back now. It was important to say that Egypt was a great country, and it's been ruined now, but, nothing we can do about that.
So when did you feel like things are changing for the Jewish community?
Sorry?
When did things started changing and deteriorate for the community, for the Jewish community in Egypt?
I think 1948 was, I think the writing was on the wall in 1948, but nobody wanted to see it. For me, most of my father's family moved to Israel in 1948, and I was 5 at the time, and I know I had 2 aunts who doted on me. And I had my sister. My sister was born by then, but they absolutely doted on me. And I saw them every day, and all of a sudden they weren't there, and nobody explained why they weren't there. And I think that was, for me, that was the first traumatic event. So 1948 was the beginning of the end, although nobody realized. But 25,000 Jews, I think, left in 1948. Then there was 1952, and then 1956, and in between, lots of reforms and lots of changes. But, Jews were settled, and they always thought, even after Farouk was overthrown, we still thought it'll be okay. And I'm pretty sure that my father, because he feared everything, my father was, like everything was the end of the world, he wouldn't have left if he hadn't been expelled. I'm sure he would have stayed till 1967. He had a coronary thrombosis when in his 50 So he probably would have died in Egypt. That's how I see it.
Can you tell us about 1952 and Black Saturday, and then about 56 as well?
So 1952, which I always remember, and it was 26th of January 1952, and it was a Saturday, and it was supposed to be in retaliation of the British massacre of 42 policemen at the Ismailia barracks, and the next day, it looks like a spontaneous uprising, but afterwards it was thought that it had been organised by the Muslim Brotherhood or the Green Jackets, one of them, I don't know. So there was a crowd of a mob that started from the poorer area of Cairo, marched to the centre, and on their way torched everything that was associated with foreign businesses, luxury, excess, whatever. So Jewish department store, Jewish banks, Jewish businesses were targeted, cinemas. There was a very iconic hotel called the Shepherd's Hotel, which was the favourite haunt of the British. That's just an aside. They used to sit there like, they were the colonial, occupiers. That was completely destroyed and burned down. And we sat on the balcony, and you could see the smoke, and you could even smell the acrid smell, and the crowd went past our street. We lived opposite the Cairo broadcasting station, and we were terrified, but they weren't interested in us. They were only interested in businesses, but at the time, obviously, you don't know that. And the next day, for a few days, we were too scared to go out anyway. And when we did go out, we just couldn't believe the devastation. It was absolutely awful. And that was very traumatic, and I'm old enough to remember that quite well. 1956, well, that was then, wasn't it? So I remember coming back from school on 29th of October, and my father was in terrible state, and he was like packing. He said, we're leaving, we're going to your aunt. And, my family never explained anything. It was just do this, and then that's it. You didn't question it. So I think because we lived opposite the radio station, he thought it could be bombed, it could be a target. My aunt lived about 15 minutes away. So we all moved in with my aunt, and then the war started, so we had to put blue paper across the windows. There was a curfew, and every evening you would hear somebody shouting Tafanur, which is like, put the lights out. So we were in the dark, until they were all clear. And you could hear tags being moved. You could hear, you knew there was a war. But my father said, "Oh, it's nothing. They're just transporting their wounded, and they're dead, and they don't want us to know." That's how my father explained it. And then they used to, in the street, in the loudspeakers and all that, they were all saying, victory and the Egyptian army is winning and all that, which of course wasn't true. But my parents and my aunt had the BBC on, very, very, obviously if we'd been caught, we would have been in trouble. And obviously the news was completely different. So because I was with my family, and I think I mentioned in the Sephardi Voices film, Kesera Sera always reminds me of that. But the nostalgia is not obviously about the war. The nostalgia is about the fact this was the last time that we were together with my aunt as a family. And a few days later, so the war ended probably after a week. We didn't go back home straight away. I think we were too frightened. And when we went home, we didn't know what to expect. We thought, the servants, are they going to turn against us? Are they going to kill us? Because they would have got away with it. Nobody would have said anything. But they weren't. They were nice. They were respectful. But then a few days later, knock on the door, middle of the night, and the officer, presented us with, my parents, with the expulsion papers, and also forced them to sign something saying they were giving all their property willingly to the Egyptian government. We were given 2 weeks to leave, which is more than some people, and there was complete panic then. First of all, trying to get, we knew we were going to England, and the main reason why we were expelled was because my mother had a British passport. My father was stateless, but he was allowed to travel with her. So panic to buy winter clothes, which didn't exist in Egypt. And obviously everybody was in the same situation. and panic to get tickets, either, leave by boat or plane, because if you overstayed the 2 weeks, my father would have ended up in prison. So it was a chaotic time, and it was quite scary.
So can you tell me what you're feeling as a 12-year-old girl, knowing that you're leaving everything behind, that you have to move, that you're forced to leave, and not really having any choice?
I think at the time, because, my parents always told me the minimum, and later on I had to work everything out. At the time, there was complete panic. And also, we had to decide who was going to leave. And they decided that my grandmother, who also had a British passport, would leave with us. She'd been a widow for years and years. And I think now, when I think about my poor grandmother, I feel very, very sad, because there she was, not speaking French or English, in a world of her own. She had started suffering from dementia anyway, and she had no say in it. And there she was, put on a plane, left, and obviously, ended up in England. I don't remember much, but when I think about it now, I think, my God, what did my parents feel, How scary was it to get in a taxi, get to the airport, and then all you know is that you're going to England. That's all you know, nothing else. You've left everything behind. Obviously, as people have said, we weren't allowed to take anything, and my father wouldn't have risked it anyway. So we had nothing. I have a chain, and I have a, Magen David, and when my mother died, I got hers as well. I don't understand how I still have it, because we weren't allowed even that, but for some reason I have that, and I'm grateful. But I think everything happened so quickly. It was only afterwards. I think at the time it was just like, we have to get out because we don't know what's going to happen. But I'm sure that when my parents got on that plane, it must have been terrifying, having 3 young children and no money and just a suitcase full of clothes, and leaving everything that I can't even envisage it, actually, if I'm honest.
And then you arrived to England, and
that's
where do you live?
That's another story. That's not even... So we arrived in England, middle of winter. We arrived on the 10th of December, 1956. My father spoke English, fortunately, because he'd been the managing director of John Dickinson. John Dickinson used to be a very well-known paper company. But we arrived, we landed at Heathrow. We arrived by plane, we refueled in Athens, I think, spent the night in Amsterdam. We were met by either a representative of the government or somebody from the Red Cross. Not a word, nobody explained anything to us. They shoved us on a bus, and they didn't tell us where we were going. It wouldn't have made any difference anywhere. All we knew was London. And then we arrived in this camp. We called it refugee camp, but it was a disused hostel. It was years later that I found out that it was not far from where I live now, Bristol. It was near Stonehouse, and it was in the middle of nowhere, and it was like all prefabricated pavilions. We each had, I think my parents had a room, and we had a room. And I think at the end of the compound, there was a canteen where we were supposed to have our meals. So the meals, shall I talk very quickly about the meals? The meals, I mean, honestly, they gave us, I mean, obviously, they were supposed to just feed us. They didn't care what they gave us. So breakfast would have been either cornflakes, which we'd never had before, or bacon and sausages. I mean, lunch was sausages as well, or pork chops. Whatever it was, we couldn't eat it. Obviously, it was pork. And then boiled cabbage. Until now, if I walk in a room and I smell cabbage or sprouts, I feel sick. And the mash wasn't mash, it was smash, which was, I think it was a powder mixed with water, I think, and runny custard. So we were hungry, we were always hungry, but we had no choice. The village children used to run circles around us and say, "Oh, did you live in a tent?" They didn't know they weren't funny, but they thought they were funny. And then we were sent to school, which I mean, nowadays, you know, children, if they come to as a refugee, their mental welfare is actually looked after. We weren't. We were just supposed to walk through muddy fields to get to a school where we didn't speak a word of the language. Nobody cared about us. Nobody spoke to me. My sisters went to primary school. I went to the secondary school. And then, and I'll never forget that, they made me strip of whatever. It was quite thin, but it was still warmer than a T-shirt and shorts. Go outside, play hockey, I think, come back and have a cold shower. So I said to my mother, I'm not going. They're mad. I said, they are mad and I'm not going. So I refused to go to school. I don't know whether I got away with it or not, but I didn't go to school. But I mean, amongst all that, now I think it's funny, but at the time it wasn't funny, but it just shows how we were struggling. We needed boots because obviously the flimsy footwear, it started snowing. So we managed to get on a bus, and I think we went to the nearest town, which was Cheltenham, I think. And the first thing we saw was boots. So we thought, hey, great, okay, we go in and buy the boots. And of course it was Boots the chemist. And at the time it was, I mean, now when I think about it, I laugh. But obviously at the time it was just another example of how lost we were. We were actually, I'm laughing about it, but it was horrible. We were really bewildered. And we didn't know what was happening. It was dark, it was cold, it was snowing. It was just, we were hungry. And we didn't know what the future was going to be. So, and 1 minute it was like Cairo with, the busy streets, the familiar sounds, the radios blaring. Next minute, you're just, a week later, you're just literally in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by silence and, people that we'd never met before. So it was traumatic.
And throughout this time, what does your father say about Egypt, or if he says anything at all?
Well, that's a problem. My father, I don't know how. I know it sounds bad, but I do feel angry with him because the first thing he said to me and to us, me and my sisters, I remember really clearly, was, "You're in England now. You have to forget all about Egypt, and you have to behave like the British do." And after that, my father and my mother completely denied any knowledge of Egypt. It's as though Egypt, hadn't existed. So I tried to be generous and say, was it trauma? But it wasn't trauma. It was just my family's way of saying, if we don't talk about it, then it's fine, it doesn't exist. And then years later, and that's something I haven't forgotten, I'd gone to Tunisia and I'd managed to find a cassette, in those days it was cassette, of a singer that had been very, very popular in Egypt. He was Jewish, he was Turkish, but he lived in France and he was very successful in France. And one of his songs had been sung for 3 months. It was so catchy, everybody knew about it. I mean, I knew all the lyrics as well. So when I got this cassette, I was so excited. So I came back to London and I showed him the cassette. I said, look what I found, of so-and-so. And he looked at me and he was completely expressionless. And he said, I don't know who you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. I said, what do you mean? I was 12 at the time and I remember. No, I don't remember. And he walked away. And I don't know why, but that really hurt me. So in a way, my book is saying, in spite of my parents, I'm remembering. Not because of my parents, in spite of my parents.
And we've discussed it before, this feeling of being ashamed of our heritage.
You've mentioned that as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, growing up, I've always felt like I have to hide it back in Israel, but also abroad. It's something that, I mean, Jewish sometimes is difficult.
As well.
Yeah.
To my shame, yeah.
Absolutely.
Jewish as well. I think the Jewish is probably because if you've been the victim, if you have been made to leave a country also because you're Jewish, somewhere in your subconscious it's like, it's not okay to be Jewish. Are people going to accept me or not when they find out? And for years, I didn't say anything. And I remember, in a way, I was right, because I remember I worked in a company for about 7 years, and I remember one guy came up one day, and he said, oh, God, they didn't know I was Jewish, I think. So he came out and he said, oh, these Jewish people, typical of them. And I remember standing up and saying, I beg your pardon, I'm Jewish. And he went, oh, my best friend is Jewish, and the usual rubbish. So, but I think with me, until recently, until 5 or 6 years ago, because I got involved with social enterprise and it made me realize that I should be proud of my heritage, this is where things changed for me. And writing the book has been so liberating in a way, because even, you know, I volunteer for refugee organizations, and for a lot of the time, because there's so many Muslims, although they're my friends, I thought, do they know I'm Jewish? Is it okay? With people who are English, is it okay to say I'm Jewish, Egyptian? Now everybody knows, and it's fine. And everybody's fine with it, so...
It's amazing, because I feel like it's very similar to my experience, you know, maybe in a different time in my life and also I think there's more readiness in the West or in progressive spaces as well to have conversations about different identities. I don't know about this identity, but I feel like because there's a conversation happening, I can speak about this, and there's more openness within the Jewish community that when you know, I've been doing this work for a decade, and I don't remember it being as open 10 years ago when I wrote my first article mentioning that my family is from Iraq and Tunisia. It was celebrated by some parts of our community when it was weaponized against Arabs or against Arab countries to make a political point. So then it was okay. But I feel like now I'm just like you mentioned. When I speak about my family, and I do identify as Mizrahi Jew, and I'm celebrating this culture, and I'm doing it online and offline, I feel more whole, and it was much harder not being proud of this identity. And even in Israel, I mean, we're
especially in Israel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's an important point. I grew up in Israel, and I think I told you in one of our conversations that it was an elementary school teacher. She was an Ashkenazi Jewish teacher, and she said something. She said, "Okay, what music do you hear at home?" And everyone was saying, you know, Ashkenazi Israeli artists. And I mentioned Kulthum. That was. I know you're not a fan, but I mentioned her, and the teacher was laughing and said, "Oh, those people have no culture." So that was this sort
That's
of
hurtful.
Very hurtful. But that was the sort of stuff that I grew up hearing and seeing around me. And although we know that Israel today has 55% of Israeli Jews are Jews that are descendants of Middle Eastern and North African Jews, and the culture itself is very Middle Eastern. The music, the food, it's what we brought with us. It's all we were allowed to bring with us. And yet I feel like there's still some this I don't know, looking to the West or thinking that West is better, or European is better, European culture that is. Which was different in our history as people. I mean, the Jewish center of life used to be the East, and I think it changed a bit. But I feel very similarly to what you just shared, that the more proud I am in every part of my identity, in everything that I am, people react to it positively and embrace it. So.
No, but when you were growing up, it wasn't the case. I think you were bullied at school.
Yeah, a lot.
Which you don't forget either.
Absolutely, yeah. In school, in popular culture, there's this. So in my book, I'm giving a few examples. That book will come out in March, so you can buy 2 of our books later on. Multiple copies.
No, yours is it's not yet published.
Yeah, no, I'm saying they can buy another copy of your book and mine. But I'm writing there that, you know, you see even there's a young rapper guy in Israel called Dudu Farouk, and he's an Ashkenazi guy that pretend to be Mizrahi.
I've heard him. And he's very good.
I mean, I don't know, because in a way is mocking Mizrahi culture and ridicule it and making it into. I mean, either way, if he's celebrating it or not, or if he's mocking it, I don't like that. So I think these are the type of cultural and popular culture things that we're still seeing in Israel that we have to change and we have to acknowledge. And if you look at the statistics, and I don't like looking at statistics, but 7% of the academic staff in Israel today, of the teachers, are Mizrahim. There are more Arab Israelis academic teachers than there are Mizrahi Jewish teachers. If you look at the wage gap between second and third generation Mizrahi Jews to second, third generation Ashkenazi Jews, there's still 2/3 wage gap. So there's so many inequalities that we still have to work to fixing. But I feel like we are moving. I mean, of course we are. If you look at, in the last since Israel was created till today, that we made huge advancement in many of those parts.
So sorry, but I was getting mixed up with this guy and another singer who's very good. Sorry, okay. And I can't remember his name, but he's good. But what I was going to say is, I get the impression that Middle Eastern culture in Israel and food and all that has become a bit fashionable now. But it doesn't take away, and that's your work as well, it doesn't take away the experience of the, of the injustice that, was 850,000 Jews were driven out of their homes. I know you're a passionate advocate about that, and that, I think, still is a separate issue. Whatever people think that, Arabic music or food or is popular, the plight of the Jewish refugees from Arab land, or what they suffered and what we have to remember, I think it's a separate issue, isn't it? Especially for you.
It is in a way, and it's not in a way. I mean, one of the newest, well, not newest, it's been around for a few years, but one of the arguments that I'm hearing is that Israelis and Jews have stolen Middle Eastern food. And we stolen Middle Eastern music. Yeah. Sorry. but perhaps instead of stolen, we've been cooking this food for hundreds of years. We've been part of we've established probably some of those dishes that are now considered Arabs were started by Jews, and we share that it's not ours alone. Of course, we're part of the Middle East, but this notion that I think it's very sophisticated way to say, because if they say that we have no culture, they're basically dehumanizing us. If people have no culture and they have no story and they have no history, it's the worst way to dehumanize the people. And I think that it goes hand in hand with the erasure that we are seeing. And if we're going outside of our community, how often have we heard about your story and stories of Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa? How many UN resolutions were passed to advance our case? When I'm asking my grandmother, and I often speak to her, and I say, I'm doing this work, I'm going and advocating, I'm writing, I'm speaking, I'm giving those interviews. What is the most important thing for you? And she's always saying, I've got what's the most important thing for me, which is my family, which is my kids and my grandchildren, and that's what makes her happy. And I'm trying to ask again, I'm saying, but what is justice? And often when we speak about justice, people have this notion of, you want your land back, you want reparations, you want the billions of dollars that was taken from us, that we want 5 times the size of the state of Israel that was taken from our community. We want to be compensated for the life that were lost, but it's not what you want. I think what is important for her is that people will acknowledge this story and what happened to us and the plight of our community. And we're really not asking for much, and maybe that's the problem. Maybe if we ask for more, people will pay more attention. But I think what we want as a community, and I'm not speaking for all of us, of course, but I think that what I'm seeing and what I'm speaking with people is that we want acknowledgement, and we want people to recognize it. We want the Jewish story to include us.
Yeah.
We want that. I know, and I'm not comparing by any rate, but I know the stories of trauma and the trauma of the Jewish people in Europe. I know because it's also reached Tunisia. My family worked in a forced labor camp in Tunisia during World War II, and we know that the Farhud was incited by Nazis. It was all part of it. But I know all those stories, and I feel like often it's not the same way. It's not the other way around. So I want. What we want, I feel, is to, and I'm, again, not talking for everyone, but what I feel like we want is to be included in the Jewish story and to be included in the global story. I want history books, including us. I want people to, when they speak about the Middle East and its makeup, that they will recognize us. One of the things that we've discussed was this notion of Arab Jews, term that I reject, because I I mean, I'm just thinking if there was if anyone would ever say to Copts, you know, you're Arab Copts, or to Yazidis, you're Arab Yazidis, or like we know that it's an imperial identity, but it feels like it's being shoved on Jews now because it's this political tool of erasure of Jewish identity. So for me, I think what I want the most is to be included.
I think that's where we totally agree, because that's, in a way, that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because I feel we want to be remembered. We must be remembered.
That's amazing. I feel like we have to go to Q&A, right? Thank you, Viviane.
Thank you, Hen. That was great.
Thank you so much, Viviane and Hen, for that insightful conversation, personal conversation. It's so valuable to have an intergenerational conversation about your experiences and how, in some ways, they very much relate to each other and speak to each other. We have time for a couple of questions, which we'll take together. Our wonderful ushers are stationed, so if you have a question, we'll raise your hand. We'll take this man over here. If you mention your name, and let me just find someone else. Anyone else? Perhaps and this young person over here.
Good evening. My name is Morris. There were many good words mentioned about the expulsion of the Jews, 850,000 of them. There was no mention of who is to blame for who is responsible for the world human rights. Like after the expulsion of 850,000 Jews, nothing was done about Rwanda, Darfur, and all the Christians that are being persecuted in the Middle East and Africa and in Turkey, and I can go on and on and on and on. Who is responsible for the human rights for the people in the world? And what are they doing about it?
I think it's an important point, and all refugees, I mean, Viviane is here volunteering for refugees in her community. I think many people are doing their part to support and to help those that are vulnerable. The UN was established, and I think we all know that we can't trust fully the UN to do. They're doing amazing work, but not. I don't think they.
So you say the UN is responsible, but they are doing a terrible work. So is anybody blaming the UN at all? Is anybody shaming the UN for doing a terrible job?
I think people are shaming them and calling them out. There's a lot of, you can look up UN Watch. There's a lot of organizations doing.
Not publicly, unfortunately.
Sorry. Board of Deputies, JLC. There are many organizations that are doing it. So you can look it up though after. Thank you for that.
That does that, and if you write to her, she is the Jewish representative from Jews of Egypt and the Middle East, and they went to, as I said, to the Parliament, and they even came here to talk in the British Parliament. So there are people, if you look and you want to see be part of those organizations, there's Levana Zamir in Israel. I don't know the name of the organization. Is Jews from Egypt. That's it.
Yeah, Harif was
Is it Lavana Zamir? I think it is, yeah. Yeah, she's done a lot of good work in Israel on behalf of the Jews from Egypt.
Thank you.
Thank you for your contributions. There'll be a chance to chat to Viviane and Hen after the talk during our reception. I just want to take the last question from this young lady.
Oh, it is? Oh, Sorry. Hi. Hi, Hen, by the way. I just wanted to say I come from a very proud Baghdadi Indian family, and I know that we're here to obviously mark the expulsion of Jews from Arab countries, and it's a very difficult story to listen to. I know that my great-grandparents came from Baghdad, and then they moved to India subsequently. And their life in India was wonderful. And I think the point is that there is a lot about the expulsion of Jews from Arab countries that is traumatic and painful, but there is also a lot to be celebrated. So I just wanted to ask both of you if you could tell me something about Mizrahi culture that you love and that you're proud of, or something even that you miss from Egypt.
Shall I go? Egypt, I miss everything from Egypt, but then I realized that you can't stop history, and things would have changed anyway. And the Egypt I remember no longer exists. Regarding Mizrahi culture, I'm very proud. I think I've said I'm very proud of having the Mizrahi and the Sephardi culture. What I like about the Mizrahi culture is, well, the food for a start, especially the Syrian Jewish food, which, put dried fruit in everything, or dried apricots and everything. I think I'm just very proud of the fact that it makes us a little bit different. I used to want to be British, but now I'm glad I'm not. Well, I'm British, sorry, but it's confusing, isn't it? Sorry, I am confused.
I believe that you can only add identities, so it's fine. You can be British, and you can be Mizrahi, and you can be Jewish, and you can be Sephardi.
I'm Egyptian Jew.
An Egyptian Jew. And I find that many of Mizrahi Jews that I'm speaking with are very proud of our national identity and celebrating the Egyptian culture and celebrating Iraqi culture. And that goes to the point that we can celebrate our national identity of where we came from without adhering to this new concepts of being an Arab, because we weren't accepted as such. But I'll also reply to this. I think the food is definitely my favorite thing. My grandmother still cooks kube every Friday, and there's different flavors. So there's like bits, like kube selek, and there's kube bamia, and every grandchild can pick whatever kube flavor he wants. And we made for Jewish News a video about the Resasai ceremony. I don't know if you know about that.
The what, sorry?
Resasai.
What's that?
It's an Iraqi Jewish ceremony, Babylonian Jewish ceremony, where they basically it's to remove evil eye from a person.
Oh God! If you read my book, there's a whole chapter about the evil eye.
Yeah. And so Resasai was something that they've done, and I think that's, when we're talking about celebrating this heritage, there's a lot of customs and things that they were doing that I think are so important to pass on and to and as Kira said, it's not. I don't want us to be focusing only on the trauma. It's definitely today. It's definitely important to speak about
Absolutely.
that. And every other day, it's definitely important. I mean, at our house, every day is Mizrahi Heritage Day. But it's important to also celebrate it every day, and for us to tell those stories and have those conversations. And I think the responsibility is on us as a community to make room for these stories, to tell them. To make sure that they are preserved, because it's part of the Jewish story, whether you want it or not. So I think it's crucial that we included it, and that after we remember what happened, that we continue to celebrate and celebrate. There's such strength. I'm sorry, last word. There's such strength in celebrating diversity, and it actually unites people more when you celebrate the diversity. Because if you tell people that they can't speak about their heritage, they're going to go away, and they're not going to be part of your community. And we are part of the Jewish community. We might be of Mizrahi descent, but we are part of the Jewish community. We're not part of any other community, but different. And to celebrate that, I think will empower us as a community so much more. So let's make sure that we're doing that. Thank you so much, Viviane, for this.
Thank you so much, Viviane and Hen. We are now delighted to be joined by Yvonne Green, prize-winning poet, who we've commissioned this evening to write something to share. We will then have candle lighting by Rabbi Joseph Dweck.
Hi, good evening. Profound thanks to everyone who's invited me here tonight. You may have something that looks like this, and for those of you who are not familiar with the Oriental habit of speaking several languages in one sentence, feel free to consult your handout. Daughters of Islam's disappeared. We're Egypt's legacy. Our mothers liked to dress up, managed wit in several languages, became our children's nonnas, yayas, memes, babushkas, metzmeyas, bubas, titas, bibis. With manicured hands, they made konafa, baklava, menena, royeba, told stories of picnics au clair de la lune, said, when asked about King Farouk eating 40 quail in one go, tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner. They'd fall from the sky in September, exhausted from the migration. They'd be caught running around. They were so tiny. Maidek. You would barbecue many at one time on one skewer till they were so crunchy you could eat the whole lot, even the bones. Our mothers preferred to pepper discourse with the possible rather than the probable, the challenge rather than the inevitable, the exception rather than the rule, mystique rather than matter of fact. Our mothers, ach ya Rab, shored up husbands when they had to rebuild their lives in middle age, translated new worlds for the parents who had sheltered their childhoods, imported for us the sources of their strength, culture, nuance, tolerance, identity. Zayik Yabashaf to brothers, Yaroch Yauni to children, Ahlan wa sahlan to the always welcome visitor, the art of the Akay, never lost. We were lucky you'd hear from the men who talk politics, set the bar low for luck. Or shall we say, made it relative to Europe's horrors, the perpetrator of which Farouk, then Nasser, admired. Matchafish, you, my mother might say, if you still spoke. Instead, at 98, you gaze out of your window on Tel Aviv's Herbert Samuel Street, at the same sea you saw when you grew up on Alexandria's Corniche. Not come upset, my New York nonna would have said, Ma'alesh, as she served me memories of Central Asia's Bukharian Emirate, from where our King Solomon dispatched men had established silk routes, while our women and children were held hostage to the trade tax their husbands would pay on their return. We were lucky you'd hear from your father, whose parents had fled Russian Central Asia in 1920. The Khan ate in our house, never touched our women. Your great-great-aunt was his court poet. It was the Bolsheviks who attacked the Jews. But the Jews are gone from there too. Mothers, grandmothers, your hand-creamed skin, soft on my forearm, you sigh a lesson. Be philosophical, not bitter. History outgrew us. Always us I rasp. alongside factions in the theatre of war, every one of us allied with Zion, conspiracy, elders of fictions, cliches of cruel cuts. Can you imagine the 9 years after 1948, the creep of Israel hate that became Jew hate, dispossession, sequestration, expulsion, escape for both nationals and the stateless alike? Did all Egypt's, 1956 Egypt's 85,000 Jews go to Israel? My mother was the only one in her family to set up home there 5 decades later, when she and my Berlin-born father left England's changing mood. After expulsion, her brothers went to Brazil, New York, France, England. One refused papers, took his own life in 1963. A brilliant doctor, welcomed to study and teach medicine at the Sorbonne, Cambridge, Montpellier, New York, who couldn't get leave to remain, couldn't face another round of begging for a passport. After the tears, Yodad Bachai, Zeh HaChayim. Nobody talked about the things that were too hard, but they talked and joked all the time about everything else in English, French, Italian, Greek, Armenian, Arabic, Spanish, Persian, Bukharian, moved between cultures without being defined by them, visited each other's places of worship if they wanted to, were word perfect in each other's liturgies. Yes, their friends knew the Shema. They could quote many surah from the Quran, recite the Our Father, sing the hymns, I was told, again and again. And we learn new languages, accents, ideas, inventions, but never lose our own. Spot each other instantly, we children of the disappeared Egypt, memorialized here tonight. The Musa, Munir, Wahba, Wasef, Abdullah, Arwas, Ahad, Nacamuli, Fedida, Rolam, Hayat, Nagar, Cohen, Meir, Bowell, Smuha, Asiman, Lanyado, Sardas, Strauss, Josipovici, Rybakov, and so many more.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, for writing that piece for us this evening. It was incredibly beautiful, and we really value your contribution to tonight. I'd like to welcome Rabbi Joseph Dweck. I'd like to welcome Rabbi Joseph Dweck, Senior Rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese community in London, to share some remarks and light the Hanukkah candles. The Chanukiah you see here this evening has been lent to us by the Halachmi family, designed by Oded Halachmi as a loan for this evening's event.
Thank you, Joe. Good evening. I want to thank Lynn and Joe for inviting me to participate tonight. The word that comes to mind tonight is poignant. Sadness and beauty mingles in my heart, and I imagine in yours. I want to thank Yvonne for those gripping and beautiful words. Thank you, Viviane and Hen, for your discussion that was uplifting and moving, and a reminiscence of sorts for all of us. And thank you, Marie and Claudia, for your representation and your leadership. As I walked in, excuse me, as I walked in tonight, I heard Kulthum playing outside. Ya habibi bukra wal akhir waqti. And I realized, first of all, it's been a long time since I've heard Kulthum, so it was good. I am a fan. The first time that I heard Kulthum, I was 9 years old. And I put it on the stereo in our house by accident. I wanted to listen to Disney songs. And by accident, it was early in the morning, I woke my father up. And I was very afraid of my father, especially waking him up. And I was shaking. And he said, "Don't worry, it's Kulthum." It made me happy to wake up. And I thought, Halabi, both sides of the family, for 500 years, at least. In Halab, we took the songs of Kulthum, of Abdul Wahab, Farid al-Atrash, Sayyid Darwish, and many, many, many more. And we took their songs and wrote Hebrew words to them. Our book of Pizmonim, of songs that we sing, is this thick. It's filled with popular Arabic music, but Hebrew words. It's the equivalent of taking Billie Eilish and Lady Gaga and Adele and writing Hebrew words to their music and singing it on the Shabbat table. That's who we are. That's our culture. Joie de vivre. I think joie de vivre is a term unlike any other that defines the Mizrahi Sephardi heart and mind. And so, yes, we rejoice in our cooking, we rejoice in our singing, but I'm a rabbi and there's something more. Our study of Torah is also special and different. Our children started Torah, their study of Torah, not in Talmud, not in the Gemara, not in the discussions of the rabbis, which is extremely important, and we got there after 15, 16 years old. We started in the Mikra, in the text of our holy scriptures, the words. We sat in the Kitab, and we taught the children, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, and the whole class would repeat, Bereshit. That's how we taught them. The words of the Torah, of the Nevi'im, of the prophets, of the Ketubim, and the scriptures were in the hearts of the children. How observant, not observant, whatever it was, that was in the hearts of the people. And that affects a people. Tonight is poignant because we remember a very sad, painful, horrific even, part of our collective history. Of being in lands for hundreds of years. I mean, you think about it, the one language that is the broadest, most consistently spoken in the Jewish world for the last 1,500 years is Arabic. No other language has been spoken as broad, as consistently, for as long a time as Arabic. It is in the fiber of our being. Harambam wrote in Arabic. Rabbeinu Sa'adiyya Gaon wrote in Arabic. It's part of our life. It's part of our history. It's part of our culture. That language is as much our language as anyone else's language. And so, yes, it is important that while we remember tonight the very painful history, and I thank you, Lynn, and Sephardi Voices, which I was honored to contribute as well, for recognizing the importance of telling our story. of teaching our story, of insisting that our story be heard and remembered. And what that really is one thing. It's knowing who we are. All of this comes down to that one point. We must know who we are, and we must teach it to our children. And teaching to our children is as Jewish gets. V'shinantam libanecha. You teach it to your children. So I'm honored to take part tonight. We're going to light now the Hanukkah. The Sephardim, that's what we call it, the Hanukkah. No Hanukkah, menorah, Hanukkah. We light the Hanukkah. And I want to say one thing about that. People recognize that Hanukkah is about miracles. They recognize that Hanukkah is about light over darkness. There's something more about Hanukkah that I think is most pertinent for tonight. And that is that essentially Hanukkah is the recognition of a Jewish identity crisis, in which we were inundated with Greek culture, Greek thought, and Greek life, which for the most part we didn't have much of an issue with. It was only when it was threatened at usurping and replacing and undermining our Judaism when we had a problem. We've been masterful at being able to absorb and create a repository for every culture we visited throughout this world and throughout history. We are a treasury of the world's cultures and thought, the Jewish people. We sing Arabic songs that they don't sing in Syria, Egypt anymore. Every Shabbat, it's in our prayers. Hanukkah is a festival that recognizes a point in history in which we had an identity crisis. We could have gone two ways. We could have either succumbed to the Greek insistence, or we could have fought for our identity. And there was a group of Jews called Maccabees that decided that they were going to fight for our identity and not relinquish it, not go, into the night without a fight, but rather they were going to rage. Even if, and this is important, they did not expect to win that battle against the Greeks. Why would they win? It was important for them, nonetheless, to fight for who they were, even if they went down in a blaze of glory trying. The beauty and miracle of Hanukkah is that we won. And so the celebration of Hanukkah is the light of identity that is our glory. That's what we light. We release the potential in this fuel into brightness and fire. Not a bonfire, a candle, a flame. But that's all we need to remember. And we keep it burning. And that's what tonight is, really. This is a recognition of the struggle against all odds to insist on our identity, to recognize it, remember it, and make it light. And so it's very significant and fitting that we should light the candles to culminate the night. And Yehi Ratzon, please God. The beauty of our story, of our continuing, unfolding story, should blaze in vivid brightness and never be forgotten. Well, I can do it our way, since it's, Harif and all. Vino Amadunai Dino Alino Asedin Kunalino Asedin Kunil Baruch Adonai Eloheinu Melech בימים ההם בזמן הזה. بس مكان عجب. النيروت النالو أنو ملكيم عن نسيم البركان والجبروت بعد شهور ونحى موشى سيدوتين بيم هم بزمان زي تهونه كدوشيم. وكل شموناتي ما يحنوكان نيروت النالو كودش هم نمشو تشتمش بهم إذا رتم بالبعد. כדי להודות לשמך, ניסיך, נפלאותיך וישועותיך. Ma'osur has become ubiquitous now, right? Ma'osur yeshuati lechana elishabeach tikon betefilasi v'sham toda
Thank you very much, Rabbi Dweck, for sharing those words and lighting the Chanukah. We really appreciate your presence here this evening. Many of us here this evening will have felt like we were looking into a mirror of our own stories and reflected back at us. And that's a privilege. It's not often that Sephardi Jews in the UK will be able to have that experience, and it's a blessing. And for some of us here this evening, we were witnesses to stories of multiple different Sephardi Mizrahi Jews this evening. Being a witness to stories is a vital part of our community, and not just something that happens. It's something that kind of makes us responsible for sharing those stories outside of the spaces that we hear them. So those who've heard new stories or new parts of your own story this evening, please make sure that you take them outside of this room, whether you're online or in the building. Take them and share them, and raise the voices of the people in this room further than the walls of JW3. I'd like to thank our partners, Harif and Julius, a wonderful partner to work with, Sephardi Voices UK, Alec, and commissioning the film from Daisy Aboudi. I'd like to thank Marie, Claudia, Rabbi Dweck, Viviane and Hen, Yvonne for your beautiful poem, Efrat for your wonderful words, and everyone for coming here tonight and watching along. We have about 100 people watching along online and about 150 people in here this evening, and it's really, really a wonderful pleasure to be here. Thank you from JW3. We hope to see you at future events. Hanukkah is our busiest time of the year. We have some wonderful events coming up over the week, so check out our website and join either online or in person. We'd love to see you. For those in person, there is a reception outside for you to connect with people who you may not have seen for a very long time in the Harif or JW3 community.